Now the Gilberts are the first major offensive by Admiral Nimitz's Central Pacific forces. The Marines go in and take the island primarily of Tarawa. But here is where we're starting to get the first real look at, wow, this is a little dinky island. It's got a bunch of Japanese on it, and it took 3 days to take this at the loss of some 3,300 American casualties, almost 1,000 of whom were killed. 76 hours of fighting for these little dinky islands that look basically like this. They look better before the shelling. This is what most of these islands look like after days of pounding by airplanes and naval guns. Those are dead Marines on the invasion beach. These island campaigns started here and became a precursor for the ever greater ferocity of the fighting throughout the Pacific. That included going on up into the Marshalls, the next major stop. This is Kwajalein, Eniwetok, Bikini, that becomes famous for the atomic tests after the war. The purpose of this, again, is to take strategic islands that we need only so we can put airfields on them to go to the next series of islands, the next campaign, and have a jumping off place for air power, for basing ships, for putting headquarters up. But it is the leapfrogging, and meanwhile, many Japanese garrisons, leave them. We cut off their supplies, they're going to starve, they're not going to be able to fight, and that was done throughout the Pacific War. The island looked something like this of Kwajalein. After it was taken, the Japanese had, by the way, 8,100 soldiers and laborers on that island. Only 230 were alive at the end of the campaign. That is the Japanese code, the way they fought most of the Pacific War. We lost 372 dead and 1,600 more wounded. But look at that terrain, and several months later, that is what it became. A major airfield to mount further strikes on the island hopping campaign. The next area, and now for the first time within what the Japanese considered their impenetrable, or certainly shouldn't be penetrated, outer perimeter of defense, and that is the Mariana Islands. The Marianas are interesting. It's a volcanic arc that lies there in the middle of the Pacific that is, at one time, the U.S. owned territory of Guam, which was taken on early December of 1941, and the other islands to the north that were part of the Japanese mandate under the League of Nations in 1920-21. Japan had played a large role for us in World War I in the Pacific, so they got some of the former German colonies there in the Pacific. They had had 20 years to build up these islands, which, by the way, was in violation of their mandate, but no matter. Guam had been taken, it had been fortified. We need those islands because that is the first time we'll have islands within the range of American air power to the home islands. They are taken in a campaign that ends up costing nearly 7,000, nearly 6,000 American troops, almost 19,000 wounded on top of that. 3 islands that we take, Guam, Saipan, and Tinian, that will become very, very big when we discuss the B-29 campaign. There was also the Battle of the Philippine Sea, where the cream of what was left of the Japanese Navy was largely decimated. They lost 3 more carriers out of a precious few that they have remaining of their fleet. They lost about 400 aircraft plus and crews. We lost 99 airplanes, mostly from fuel starvation. A terrible one-sided victory that became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The island of Tinian, interestingly, looked like this with, at the north end, this is the north end, at the bottom of the picture, there's a Japanese airfield at Ushi Point. That is going to become the famous airfield of Northfield Tinian. And from that picture This is what we built. The circled area there is the Japanese airfield underneath the phenomenally larger American airfield. One thing that I think ought to be driven home to every American is that when you hear the term Seabees, the Naval Construction Battalions, or the Army Corps of Engineers, thanks to the unparalleled capability in any other country in the world, we could go into Normandy, we could go into an island, we could go into the Philippines, whatever, and almost instantly, something hard to imagine today, build airfields, build naval port facilities, clear wreckage, turn these islands into bastions for American troops to operate from, and that happened in days. No other country in the world had the capability construction-wise that we had because of Seabees and combat engineers. The next step for MacArthur, having secured New Guinea, is to move into the Philippines. He had promised he would return. They went up into the Philippines, first at Leyte, and then other islands, Mindanao, the Negros, Panay, Luzon itself, where the capital of Manila is located. That started in October of '44, and MacArthur was still taking islands. His forces were up until VJ Day, because there are many, many islands in the Philippine archipelago. There was another major battle here, which that is the island that, or the campaign that finally destroyed what was left of the Japanese Navy. Their naval air power at that point was essentially extinct. This is a famous picture of MacArthur fulfilling his promise of 20th of March 1942 when he arrived in Australia that I shall return, and here he is returning, amply covered by the press. And there's a long story you can read about General MacArthur, but one of the great naval, or one of the great Army leaders of our American history, no question. The next step for Nimitz's campaign, while MacArthur is taking the Philippines and moving up through there, is Admiral Nimitz needs to get Iwo Jima. Iwo Jima has several purposes. It's a little volcanic island that ended up costing us dearly. Out of the 22,000 Japanese troops on the island, only about 216 were taken. You may have seen the movie Letters from Iwo Jima, the ferocity of the fighting there. There have been plenty of movies about Iwo, all the way from John Wayne on up. But a tremendous campaign that starts to really bring home this little crummy island of volcanic ash you can't even grow anything on. It becomes, wow, we lost 6,000 Marines taking it. But the value of Iwo Jima, and this is a picture of Mount Suribachi in the back, which the Japanese, of course, had heavily fortified and used as an observation post. The Marines had to land in this volcanic ash. You couldn't even get mechanized vehicles to come up. It's like you trying to crawl out of a sand pile. Fierce fighting.
And it's sharp too.
Oh, sharp. I mean, it is a horrible place. Iwo became known as just one of the worst pieces of ground in the world, but we had to take it. And what the reason is that Japanese had fighters on the island that could intercept B-29s making raids at Japan, and also we needed to have an established place to rescue B-29s that couldn't make it back to their islands, and to put fighter cover to escort them. So it was a costly victory, but in the end, the calculus of war, we lost fewer people than we would have by far if we had not taken Iwo Jima. The next island and the last major campaign of the Pacific War was Okinawa. Okinawa is south of the main islands of Japan, and it guarded the southern approaches to Kyushu. Any invasion, the Japanese knew it, we knew it, was going to have to go in through Kyushu first. Okinawa had to fall. It's a fairly...
Kyushu being the southernmost major island.
Absolutely, and you can just barely see it on that map. We'll talk about Kyushu more later on. on. But the point is, Okinawa had to fall. Okinawa is a large island with a large population, probably about 77,000 soldiers and 150,000 civilians. We invaded with 6 divisions and lost 14,000 dead. Wait a minute. The American public is getting these kinds of numbers. This is early 1945. This war isn't over yet, and we've just lost thousands and thousands of Americans. God, how bad is it going to be if we invade Japan? And this weighs heavily in later decisions. There's a couple pictures, the ferocious fighting, of course, cave to cave, hole to hole, and the civilian population, probably about 100,000 died on the island. Not a pleasant thing for them, obviously.
And a lot of that had to do with the Japanese education of the civilians before the U.S. invaded.
On all of these islands, they were told there would be rape, pillage, killing of babies, etc. On Saipan, several thousand Japanese jumped over cliffs, commit suicide rather than be put under the American control, because it was the ferocity of the fighting in the Pacific that was almost hard to imagine today. The kamikaze comes in very, very big, both in the latter stages of the Philippine campaign and particularly at Okinawa. This is a picture of one airplane about to get through all the fighters and the guns and hit a U.S. ship. We lost over 30 ships sunk and a couple hundred damaged. 5,000 sailors did not make it out of the Okinawa campaign alive. The airplane on the right is one of the many that was shot down, but for all of those that shot down, a number got through. Now, one thing you ought to understand is that we had approved an invasion of Japan. It appeared to be the only way that the islands were going to be taken. Armies have always had to invade the home territory. Only actually in World War I did the Allied armies not really go into Germany before Germany capitulated. This wasn't showing any signs of giving up, so we were going to invade. 2 American field armies were going to go in, the first under Operation Downfall, the overall taking of the islands. Under Operation Olympic, we were going to invade southern Kyushu on the 1st of November, 1945. Now think about the casualties, the potential casualties that could come up from this invasion, and the overall loss in men, material, and whatnot. This weighs into the decision-making process. If Kyushu does not succeed in turning the Japanese government into surrender, then the Tokyo Plain was the next operation in Operation Coronet on the 1st of March, 1946. And all I can say is thank goodness we never had to do either one of these invasions from either the Japanese perspective or the American perspective. Now, the role of strategic air power, which again is what we're kind of talking about, long before the B-29s get in there, we have 2 air forces operating in the Pacific. 7th out of Hawaii, working along with Admiral Nimitz's forces going up through the Central Pacific, and the 13th primarily supporting the southern southwest Pacific area, along with the 5th Air Force that's more tactical. Those 2 air forces progressed roughly on those lines, following the paths we've already discussed on the ground operations. But then we have the strategic operation designed to attack the means of the Japanese making war, and that's 20th Air Force, first out of India, China, and then out of the Marianas, those islands in the Japanese perimeter that had to be taken by the American forces in order to finally give us a place that we could attack Japan for the first time since the Doolittle raid of 1942. A little known operation is the 11th Air Force, flying out of some of the worst flying weather in the world, the Aleutians, and it attacked only Hokkaido. But that was the only force where we could attack the northernmost of the Japanese home islands. Not a significant campaign, but it actually hit textile factories and other industrial facilities on that island.
I was going to ask what there were for resources in Hokkaido, because it's still a very
Hokkaido did have textiles and some other lighter industry.
But not
It's not Honshu. It's not Kyushu, which are your primary heavy industry. And to finish off the talk about the Pacific, I'll go back to the same chart that I used in the European discussion. You take a look at this one more time, and now understanding what went on in the Pacific, remember that it's hard to say, well, these Allied losses were the European campaign, and these were the Pacific, because the United States, to a more limited extent, Great Britain, certainly Soviet Union, very, very heavily involved in particularly the last week or two of the war, where they invaded the Japanese-held Manchuria. That is casualties on both of these, if you will, separate wars going on that are all part of the one great big cataclysm. And when you look at those numbers, it's hard to say, well, it's 20% over in the Pacific and 80% over in Europe. You could probably work up some rough numbers, but it's the overall thing that I think people ought to understand. 60, 70, 75, 80 million people died in that war. And again, the strategic bombing of Japan, probably it's estimated around 300 to 400,000 people killed, civilians largely, again, on the bombing campaign that we'll discuss later on, but hardly the majority of the Japanese losses in World War II.